All right, I hope you enjoyed the series on coverages. A few things more important as a quarterback or a coach or play caller, play designer than understanding what the opponent is giving you from a coverage standpoint, what the nuances of those coverages are, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses, and how to attack them. All right, maybe the second most important thing for any of those roles to understand is protections. Now, I know it's not sexy, but to me, it's extremely important. And one of the things that I spent probably more time on than anything else besides understanding what we were doing inside the playbook and what my role and responsibilities were on each particular pass play. So we're going to go into a series where we're talking about protections over the next few weeks. So I hope you don't tune out. Pay attention because it's extremely important. In doing this, we're going to go back and visit the very first Blackboard breakdown that we had. And we talked about recognizing defenses and specifically recognizing defensive fronts. And that is so important when it comes to protections, is understanding the defensive fronts and the nuances within those defensive fronts. So you remember it first started with the box count, right? Box is the imaginary box that encompasses our offensive line, and then recognizing how many defensive players are inside there. So once again, here, quick review, 4 defensive linemen makes it a 40 front, 2 linebackers, we would call this a 42, okay? We take a defensive lineman out of there, we move it over a little bit. Now we've got 3 defensive linemen, so it becomes a 30 front, still 2 linebackers, becomes a 32 front. Okay? So that's how we recognize fronts. Recognize the personnel that is in the game, how many defensive linemen, how many linebackers, how many are in our protection issues or in our blocking schemes, how many we have to account for. Okay? So 4 down linemen is pretty easy concept. We understand that. Okay? We didn't talk a lot about the 30 looks, the 3 defensive lineman looks. So I want to dive into that a little bit. So we've got a 30 look here. 1 tackle, 2 defensive ends. Okay, we've got our 3 linebackers as always, our Will, Mike, and Sam. Always recognized from the weak side first. Okay, right formation, so our Will is on the weak side. But we just lost a defensive lineman. We got to bring in a linebacker. Okay, so notice I'm going to move the Will to the outside, and I'm going to bring in this Jack. Okay, so our 4th linebacker in a 3-4 here on QB Confidential, we're going to call the Jack. Why the Jack? I don't know. We just always called it the Jack. I don't know if it has to do with Jack and Will, kind of like Jack and Jill, but regardless, Jack becomes our 4th linebacker. Notice I moved the Will back to the outside. Always want to start our counts, linebacker counts, from the weak side. First linebacker to the weak side becomes the Will linebacker, and then we move from there, okay? Normal 3 linebackers, it's Will, Mike, Sam. Okay, when the Jack comes in, we got 4 linebackers. The Jack becomes the guy in between the Will and the Mike. So it just goes Will, Jack, Mike, Sam, just as I've got drawn up there. Okay, so that's a 3-4. Just wanted you guys to understand who that 4th linebacker is and how he fits into the mix. Okay, so that's where it really starts, is just understanding defensive linemen and linebackers, because when it comes to protections, we always want our big guys blocking their big guys, right? We want defensive linemen blocked by offensive linemen. We want linebackers blocked by our smaller guys, our running backs, our tight ends, our fullbacks, if we can do that, okay? So that's why it becomes so important. Now, basic 3-4, basic 4-3, those are easy. But then there's some nuances that come into play as well. And so not only is it about, when it comes to protections, not only is it about how many defensive linemen we have, but it's about where those defensive linemen are. And in particular, how many guys are covering our offensive linemen. So you see in this particular case, we've got 1, 2, 3 guys covering our offensive linemen. Okay, so we're going to make sure that our offensive linemen block those guys. Okay, it's a 30 front. Okay, but what if we took these guys and shifted them? So let's say we shifted them over there, and this defensive end shifted over here, and now this Will linebacker came down and was on the edge of the line of scrimmage. Okay, you'll notice that when we're looking at these 4 guys right here, okay, I understand that there's only 3 defensive linemen and 1's a linebacker, but if you notice, it looks just like the 4 down lineman set that we had, right? We've got 4 guys covering our offensive line, Okay, so now when it comes to protections, we can treat this like a 4 down look. We can treat this in terms of, we could easily just make this guy right here. We could erase him right there, and we could come back and we could make him, okay, a defensive end right here. Okay, so we make him an end. All right, that would make this guy inside a defensive tackle, okay, because they're covering our offensive line. Again, that becomes key. So we recognize this as a 4 down look regardless of what the players are. Whether the player's a linebacker or whether the player's a defensive lineman, doesn't matter. As long as they're in a cover position on our offensive line, we'll recognize it that way. So now we could erase that jack and it would just become a will right there. Now again, I recognize this guy right here, okay? I recognize that guy is a linebacker by position, but based on his alignment, we simply make him a defensive end in that look, and we are good to go. So now our offensive line recognizes, okay, these 4 guys are covering us. We're going to block those 4 guys for sure, and then we're going to move on from there based on the protection that we have called. Okay? We are going to move this around again. We're going to take this guy out of there. We're going to go back to our 3 down look. All right, we're back here. Okay, we're going to put our jack in here again. Okay, so he's inside. All right, so one way we talked about it, if they shift the front and now we get guys covering our offensive line, okay, we'll count those guys that are covering as defensive linemen and we'll go from there. Okay, let's say that they don't shift and they've got 3 guys covering our offensive line in this particular case. So we know that our offensive line is going to cover those 3 guys. Okay, they're going to block those 3 guys. Okay, but now we've got an extra linebacker in the mix. The normal way, the base way in which we protect a 3-4 is we say, okay, we want the will to be the will all the time. So in every protection, you're going to have somebody responsible for the will. Okay, so we're going to leave him out there by himself, and we're going to make the offensive lineman responsible for the jack in all of our base coverages. Now, there's nuances that we'll talk about that come off of that, but in our base coverages, offensive linemen are responsible for this jack. So this jack, in essence, becomes like a 4th down lineman, no matter where he's located. And those 4 guys are blocked by our offensive line. Then they adjust from there. And we've still got our Will, Mike, and Sam that we can recognize in the protections moving forward. Okay? So by the same token, we could move this whichever way and however way we wanted to. So let's just say, for instance, we wanted to put this defensive end down here. This defensive end down here. Okay, now we're going to put these outside linebackers on the edge. Both sides on the edge. Okay, so again, it's still 3-4 personnel. 3 defensive linemen, 4 linebackers. Okay, but notice once again, how many guys are covering our offensive line? So in this case, every one of our offensive line is covered. So this is a look where, from an offensive standpoint, we would say this is a 5 down look. We've got all of our offensive linemen covered, okay? So from there, we're going to let our offensive linemen block all 5 of those guys, right? So again, the front can be determined by number of defensive linemen, number of linebackers. Front can also be determined based off of how many guys are covering our offensive line. It can be 3, it could be 4, it can be 5 in this particular look. So now we go, man, this is a 5 down look. Okay, this is a 5 down look. And we let our offensive linemen worry about those 5 guys. And then these guys become our stack backers. So once again, I know this guy is the will position. Okay, in most situations, we would probably switch this around a little bit. We could call that jack whatever we wanted to call him. We could call him a defensive end. We could call him a linebacker. Doesn't really matter. But we're going to put our will back here in a stack position because, again, we want our players to recognize the will linebacker, the Mike linebacker, and the Sam linebacker because that will denote who's blocking who in the different protections. So here we've got a 5 down look, right? Offensive linemen take those 5, and then in this particular case, our T and our F, and whoever's blocking in this particular case would start their count based on the other guys, the guys that the offensive line are not blocking. So that becomes critical as we're doing all of this from a protection standpoint, is yes, understand what the defensive front is called. Is it a 3-4? Is it a 3-2? Is it a 4-2? Is it a 4-3? That's important. But when it comes to protections, it's really about who's blocking who, right? We need to know who's blocking who. And we want our offensive linemen to block big guys. We want them to block the most dangerous guys, or the guys that we think are in the best position to blitz or bring pressure. We want our big guys blocking those guys. So we recognize fronts when it comes to protections based on how many guys are covering our offensive line. Doesn't matter if they're linebackers, doesn't matter if they're safeties, doesn't matter if they're defensive linemen. We want to be able to recognize who's covering our offensive linemen, if they've shifted a front, right? Who's in a position where they have to rush, and we're going to take care of those guys with our offensive line so we can get our backs and our receivers out in the route and give us the best chance to be successful that we can have. Okay, so that's just the basis of it. We're going to bounce into more and talk more of those details once we get into 7-man, 6-man, 5-man protections. But I wanted to give you guys a basic background on the different ways in which we set up or recognize the defense so we can denote who's blocking who on a particular protection. All right, we'll bounce into more of those nuances and specific protections, number of players being protected, right, and number of looks that we could see and how that adjusts up front. We'll dive into that next week.